So in this lecture, we're going to talk about conducting experiments. So to give you an overview, we'll review the key components of an experiment from the previous lecture, and then we'll spend time talking about the nuts and bolts of conducting experiments. So in terms of our review, the thing you need to remember about an experiment is that experiments are looking for causal relationships. You're trying to establish a cause and effect relationship. And as we discussed in the previous lecture, there are three important components to an experiment. One is the manipulation of the independent variable, and you manipulate that one variable, or if there's more than one independent variable, those independent variables, while keeping everything else constant. Next, you randomly assign individuals to the different levels of that manipulation. Now, when I say levels, I mean conditions. So there could be two conditions. That means there's two levels. So there could be the no caffeine group and the caffeine group. Those are different levels or different conditions. And the goal of random assignment is to create equivalent groups prior to their exposure to the independent variable. Then after they're exposed to the different levels of the independent variable, you compare the means of those levels to see if they differ. If they significantly differ, that indicates that the independent variable had an effect on the dependent variable. If the conditions don't differ, if the means of those conditions don't differ, then that indicates that the independent variable didn't have an effect on the dependent variable. So let's just do this quick example. A researcher conducts a study to determine whether smiling affects students' interest in the course material. In her 8 a.m. physiological psychology course, she never smiles while teaching, while in her 11 a.m. psychology course, she smiles often while teaching. At the end of the semester, she gives students a questionnaire to assess the extent to which students like the course material. The results showed that the students liked the 11 a.m. course material more than the 8 a.m. course. What are the levels of the independent variable? All right, so the independent variable is smiling, so either she's smiling or she's not smiling. Those are the different levels. What's the dependent variable? You're looking at how much the students liked the course. So maybe you ask them on the 1 to 7 scale, how much did you like the course? And higher scores mean they like the course more. So the question is, are there any confounding variables here? Right? So one of the goals of an experiment is to eliminate confounding variables. You address some of those confounding variables by having random assignment. That gets rid of individual differences. But confounding variables can also be things that vary along with the independent variable. So if you look at it carefully, in the 11 a.m. course, she's smiling, where in the 8 a.m. course, she's not smiling. That's problematic, right? Because it could simply be that students didn't like the 8 a.m. course as much as the 11 a.m. course because it's at 8 a.m. in the morning. Who wants to take class that early, right? So it may not have anything to do with the professor smiling or not. It could simply be the fact that it's 8 o'clock in the morning. So the time of day of the course is varying with the manipulation of the independent variable. So one way that you can address that potential confound is to make the course at the same time. So maybe you have it where she's smiling at 11 a.m. on a Monday, Wednesday course, and then she's not smiling at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, Thursday course. So now the time of day doesn't matter, right? It's 11 o'clock in both conditions, and the one thing that is varying is whether or not she's smiling or whether she's not smiling. All right, so now let's review again, talk about independent groups design. And this is when participants are randomly assigned to only one level of the independent variable, right? So one condition. And the key is that it's called independent groups because the individuals in one condition are independent of participants in the other condition, right? So when you're thinking about independent groups, also called the between subjects design, you have a pool of individuals. You randomly assign them to the different levels of the manipulation, right? So we have condition A, condition B, and then you want to compare the means for condition A to the mean for condition B to see if they differ. If they differ, you can attribute that to the manipulation. If they don't differ, then you would say the manipulation of the independent variable had no effect on the dependent variable. Another type of experimental design is what's called a repeated measures design, also called within subjects design. And this is when participants are assigned to more than one level of the independent variable. So an example we have here, students took an essay test and a multiple choice test, right? So in one level, they take the essay test, and then later they take the multiple choice test. Or it could be they take the multiple choice test and then the essay test. The point here is that they take both types of tests, and you want to see if student scores differed on the essay test versus the multiple choice test. So now you have one sample of participants. They get exposed to the essay test, and then they get exposed to the multiple choice test. And then you look at their scores and compare their scores on the essay versus the multiple choice. So the key here is that the same participants are in both conditions, whereas with the independent groups, they're assigned to only one condition. They either take the essay test or the multiple choice test. They don't take both. But for repeated measures, they take both. So here's an example of that. So Professor Foley conducted a cola taste test. Each participant in the experiment first tasted 2 ounces of Coca-Cola and then 2 ounces of Pepsi. A rating of the cola's flavor was made after each test. Right, so they first had Coke, then they had Pepsi. What are some potential problems with this experimental design? So one problem is, what we talked about last class, is there could be order effects. So maybe the fact that they had Coke first and then Pepsi, the Coke might have influenced their responses to Pepsi because they're making a contrasting the different flavors. So that order effect of having Coke and then Pepsi is problematic. So what you could do is you could counterbalance. You can give some people Coke and then Pepsi, or you can give other people Pepsi and then Coke. So now you've randomly assigned people to different orders in which they're exposed to the different levels of the independent variable. You could also have a longer break in between when they're exposed to the different drinks. So maybe you have them drink Coke, and then an hour later you have them drink Pepsi, or a day later you have them drink Pepsi. The longer the gap, the less likely you're going to have these contrasting effects. And remember, we talked about different order effects. We have practice effects, fatigue effects, contrast effects. And again, one way to address any of these effects would be to use counterbalancing and then to make the intervals between the different levels longer. And again, counterbalance is when you're randomly assigning people to different orders in which they're exposed to the levels of the independent variable. So for this counterbalance, this is a much more complicated counterbalancing approach. You have one group who can get A, B, and then C. Another group would get A, C, and B, and so on. So you're basically changing the order in which each of the groups are exposed to the different levels of the independent variable. So there's 3 levels, and they're getting in different orders in which they're exposed to those levels. Increasing the time interval, again, would lessen the likelihood that there would be any kind of spillover effect from being exposed to the first independent variable on people's responses to the second independent variable. So the longer that gap, the less likely their first exposure would affect their second exposure. All right, so that was our review. Just want to make sure that we are really clear on some of those basic ideas with experiments. Now what I want to do is I want to spend a few minutes talking about 5 kind of nuts and bolts issues when it comes to doing an experiment. So let's start with 1 and we'll work our way through to 5. First one, selecting participants. Now, for any study, you have a population of people and you need to now get a sample of individuals from that population. So a smaller subset of individuals from the population. And the question becomes, do you want to use non-probability sampling or probability sampling, right? And that really comes down to the issue of, do you care more about internal validity or external validity? And when you're thinking about internal validity, you care about the establishing a cause and effect relationship. But when you're thinking about external validity, you care about being able to generalize your effects to the broader population. So if you care about generalizing to the broader population, you're going to want to use a probability sampling approach because probability samples are going to try to mirror or represent the characteristics of the population. Non-probability sampling approaches don't create samples that will represent the population. But for an experiment, we're not really concerned about initially about generalizing to the population. The primary focus is on establishing internal validity. And as a result, we can use a non-probability sampling approach, so either convenient sampling approach, is typically the most likely approach to use, because we don't really want to, we're not focused on getting a sample that directly represents the population. We just need individuals from that population. And we're going to randomly assign them to the different levels of our independent variable so we can start to establish a cause and effect relationship. So the key here is that when you're doing an experiment, you're most likely going to want to use a non-probability sampling approach because it's easier to get access to, because your primary focus is on internal validity. And again, if you have convenient samples, you're just getting people that you can get access to. So maybe it's a Psych 101 subject pool. And again, what you're going to do is you're going to randomly assign people to different levels based upon your manipulation. And your number one focus is not on trying to generalize those results. So your focus is really on internal validity.